The dust swirled across the barren trail like a whisper of death as Willa Prescott collapsed to her knees, her parched lips cracked and bleeding, her once vibrant emerald eyes sunken into hollow pits of desperation. The merciless Arizona sun beat down upon her slender frame, now reduced to little more than skin stretched painfully over bone after days without sustenance. Her journey had begun with hope, but now seemed destined to end in a lonely, unmarked grave in the unforgiving terrain of the frontier. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life in the booming silver mining town of Placerville, Arizona Territory, had drawn Willa from her comfortable but stifling existence in Boston following the death of her parents. The stagecoach robbery 3 days prior had left her without provisions, money, or hope, forcing her to continue on foot through the ruthless desert landscape. As consciousness began to slip away, the distant thunder of hoofbeats seemed more hallucination than salvation. The world tilted sideways as she felt her body connect with the sun-baked earth, dust clouds rising around her like a shroud. The last thing Willa registered before darkness claimed her was the silhouette of a man against the blazing sky, his broad-brimmed hat creating a halo of shadow as he dismounted and rushed toward her fallen form. Lucas Morgan had seen his share of death in his 30 years. The Civil War had claimed his youth, the frontier his innocence, but something about the woman lying motionless in the dirt stirred an unfamiliar protective instinct in his weathered heart. Her clothing, though dusty and torn, spoke of Eastern refinement, and her delicate features, despite being gaunt from obvious hunger, hinted at a natural beauty that hardship had failed to erase. He knelt beside her, pressing calloused fingers to her neck, relieved to find a faint pulse fluttering beneath her skin. Gently, he lifted her slight form into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, and placed her carefully on his horse before mounting behind her. Her body slumped against his chest as he guided his faithful stallion, Thunder, toward his homestead a few miles away. Lucas's small ranch lay nestled in a verdant valley, a stark contrast to the surrounding arid landscape. A modest cabin, stable and corral comprised the heart of his hard-won piece of the territory, the result of 5 years of back-breaking labor and stubborn determination. It wasn't much compared to the sprawling cattle operations further north, but it was his, free and clear. Inside the cabin, Lucas placed the unconscious woman on his bed, the only proper piece of furniture he owned besides a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. He wet a cloth and gently wiped the dust from her face, revealing skin that, despite its pallor, was youthful and unmarred. He guessed her to be in her early 20s, not much younger than himself. Her eyelids fluttered as he worked, and a soft moan escaped her lips. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Lucas hurried to fetch a cup of cool water from the bucket he'd drawn from the well that morning. Supporting her head with one hand, he held the cup to her lips with the other. "Slow now," he cautioned as she tried to gulp the precious liquid. "Just a little at a time or you'll make yourself sick." She obeyed, taking small sips until the cup was empty. Her eyes, a striking emerald green, opened fully and focused on him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she managed, her voice stronger now but still raspy. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You very nearly did, madam," Lucas replied, setting the cup aside. "What's your name, if you don't mind my asking?" "Willa Prescott." She attempted to sit up but fell back weakly. "Lie still, Miss Prescott. You're safe now. I'm Lucas Morgan. This is my ranch." A faint smile crossed her pale lips. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morgan, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Her eyes closed again as exhaustion claimed her. Lucas sat beside the bed for a long moment, studying her face. There was something about her that stirred unfamiliar feelings in his chest. Shaking off the sensation, he rose and moved to the fireplace to prepare a simple broth. She would need nourishment when she woke, something gentle on a stomach that had clearly been empty for days. As the savory scent of the cooking broth filled the cabin, Willa stirred again. Lucas dipped a spoon into the pot and brought it to her lips. "Try this," he urged softly. "Just a little to start." She accepted the spoonful, closing her eyes as the warm liquid soothed her throat. "It's wonderful," she murmured. "It's just a simple broth," Lucas replied with a slight shrug, "but it'll help get your strength back." Patiently, he fed her one spoonful at a time, careful not to rush her weakened system. Between sips, she told him of the stagecoach robbery that had left her stranded. "They took everything," she explained, her voice gaining strength with each swallow of broth. "My trunk, my reticule with all my money. I had letters of introduction to the schoolmaster in Placerville. I was to be the new teacher." Lucas nodded, offering another spoonful. "Placerville's about 15 miles south of here. It's grown quite a bit since they struck silver in the Bradshaw Mountains. They've been waiting on a proper teacher for some time now." "I fear they'll have to wait longer," Willa said with a sigh. "I doubt I'll be fit for travel anytime soon and without my letters or any means of proving my identity." "Don't worry about that now," Lucas interrupted gently. "First, we need to get you well. The rest will sort itself out." Over the next few days, Willa's strength gradually returned under Lucas's attentive care. He continued to feed her simple but nourishing meals, starting with broths and progressing to more substantial fare as her body adjusted. During daylight hours, he tended to his small herd of cattle and the essential chores of the ranch, but evenings were spent in quiet conversation by the fire. Willa learned that Lucas had come west after fighting for the Union in the Civil War, seeking peace and purpose after witnessing too much death. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a miner, and briefly as a lawman before saving enough to purchase his own land. He lived alone, his nearest neighbors 5 miles distant, and rarely ventured into Placerville except for supplies. In turn, Lucas discovered that Willa was the daughter of a respected Boston physician who had left her a modest inheritance upon his recent passing. With no family remaining, and tired of the constraints placed upon unmarried women in Eastern society, she had answered an advertisement seeking a qualified teacher for the frontier settlement. "I wanted adventure," she admitted on the 4th evening, sitting up in bed with a blanket around her shoulders. "How foolish that seems now." Lucas, seated in a chair he'd pulled close to the bedside, shook his head. "Not foolish, brave. Most women wouldn't have the courage to travel so far alone." Willa's laugh was soft but bitter. "Brave? I nearly died on the trail like some hapless character in a dime novel if you hadn't found me when you did." "But I did find you," Lucas interrupted, his voice firm. "And you'll recover. That speaks to your strength, not your weakness." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something electric passed between them. Willa was the first to look away, a flush coloring her hollow cheeks. By the end of the week, Willa was able to stand and walk short distances, though she tired quickly. Lucas fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy branch to help her maintain her balance, and she began to take brief strolls around the cabin while he worked nearby, always watchful in case she faltered. One morning, Lucas returned from tending the cattle to find Willa at the stove stirring a pot of beans. "What are you doing?" he asked, more sharply than he'd intended. She turned, startled by his tone. "I thought I should contribute something." "You've been so kind, and you're still recovering," he cut in, moving to take the wooden spoon from her hand. "There's no need for you to work." Willa's chin lifted, a spark of defiance in her eyes. I'm not an invalid, Mr. Morgan. I may not be at full strength, but I'm certainly capable of stirring a pot of beans. I won't be a burden on your charity." Lucas's expression softened. "You're not a burden, Miss Prescott. I just don't want you pushing yourself too hard and suffering a setback." "I appreciate your concern," she replied, her tone softening as well, "but I need to do something useful. It's important to me." He studied her face for a moment, seeing the determination behind the lingering weakness, and nodded. "All right, but promise you'll rest if you start feeling tired." She smiled, the expression transforming her face and causing Lucas's heart to skip a beat. "I promise." From that day forward, they fell into a comfortable routine. Willa gradually took over the domestic tasks within the cabin, cooking, mending, and tidying, while Lucas handled the outdoor work. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading from one of the few books Lucas owned, sometimes simply talking or enjoying companionable silence. As Willa's strength returned, so did her natural beauty. The hollow gauntness of her face filled out, revealing high cheekbones and a delicate jawline. Her hair, washed and brushed, gleamed like polished mahogany in the firelight, and her eyes sparkled with renewed vitality. Lucas found himself increasingly distracted by her presence, his gaze lingering on her when she wasn't looking, his heart quickening when she smiled. For her part, Willa found her admiration for Lucas growing daily. He was unlike any man she had known in Boston, straightforward and honest, without pretense or artifice. His hands were rough from labor, his face weathered by sun and wind, but there was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior. 2 weeks after her collapse on the trail, Willa announced her intention to travel to Placerville. "I need to speak with the schoolmaster," she explained over breakfast. "Even without my letters of introduction, I might still be able to secure the teaching position." Lucas's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The thought of Willa leaving created an unexpected hollowness in his chest. "Are you sure you're strong enough for the journey?" "I believe so," she replied, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "And I can't impose on you indefinitely." "You're not imposing," Lucas said quickly. "You've more than earned your keep with the cooking and mending. And the company," he added, his voice softening. Willa looked down at her plate, a blush staining her cheeks. "Nevertheless, I must establish myself. I came west to build a new life, not to depend on the charity of a stranger, however kind." Lucas nodded, understanding her need for independence despite his reluctance to see her go. "I'll take you to town tomorrow, then. We can speak to Albert Wilson. He's the schoolmaster and a fair man. He'll likely be glad to have you, letters or no." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Lucas hitched his wagon while Willa prepared a small bundle of the few possessions she had: a spare dress Lucas had procured from a neighbor's wife, a hairbrush, and a shawl. She wore her original traveling dress, now mended and cleaned as best as possible. The journey to Placerville took most of the morning, the wagon jolting over the rough trail. Willa sat beside Lucas on the bench, her shoulder occasionally brushing against his when the wheels hit a particularly deep rut. Neither spoke much, an unacknowledged tension hovering between them. Placerville had grown considerably since the Silver Strike 3 years earlier. What had once been little more than a collection of tents and ramshackle cabins had evolved into a proper town, with wooden buildings lining a wide main street. A church steeple rose at one end, while the clanging of hammers from the blacksmith's forge punctuated the bustle of daily commerce. Lucas helped Willa down from the wagon in front of the schoolhouse, a modest but well-built structure at the edge of town. Children's voices could be heard from within, reciting multiplication tables in unison. "Are you nervous?" Lucas asked, noting the way Willa smoothed her dress and patted her hair. She offered a tremulous smile. "A little. I look hardly presentable and without my credentials." "You'll do fine," he assured her, placing a hand briefly on her arm. "Wilson's a reasonable man, and they're desperate for a proper teacher." The classroom fell silent as they entered, 20 pairs of curious eyes turning to assess the newcomers. Albert Wilson, a thin man with spectacles and a serious demeanor, set down his chalk and approached them. "Mr. Morgan," he said, extending his hand. "This is a surprise. What brings you to town on a school day, Mr. Wilson?" Lucas nodded in greeting. "I'd like to introduce Miss Willa Prescott. She was on her way to Placerville to take the teaching position when her stagecoach was robbed. She lost everything, including her letters of introduction." Wilson's eyebrows rose as he turned to assess Willa. "Miss Prescott, from Boston?" "Yes, sir," Willa replied, straightening her shoulders despite her worn appearance. "I was hired through correspondence with the town council. I have a teaching certificate from the Boston Normal School and 3 years' experience at the Roxbury Ladies' Academy." Wilson's face broke into a relieved smile. "We received a telegram last week inquiring about your whereabouts. The council feared something had befallen you on the journey." He turned to the class. "Children, continue with your arithmetic. I'll return shortly." Outside, Wilson expressed his gratitude to Lucas for bringing Willa to town. "We've been making do with temporary instructors, but none with proper training. The children suffer for it, especially the older ones preparing for further education." To Willa, he added, "The town has prepared accommodations for you, Miss Prescott. Mrs. Davenport runs a respectable boarding house for single ladies. Several of the mothers have collected suitable clothing for you until you can replace your lost items." Willa's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I feared without my documents." "Your reputation preceded you," Wilson assured her. "The superintendent in Boston spoke highly of your abilities." "When can you start?" "Tomorrow, if that would be acceptable," Willa replied without hesitation. Wilson nodded, clearly pleased. "Excellent. I'll introduce you to the class before they leave today, and you can observe my methods for the remainder of the day." Willa turned to Lucas, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more complex. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done, Mr. Morgan." Lucas shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "No thanks necessary. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she disagreed softly, "not anyone. What you did," her voice caught, "you saved my life." Wilson, sensing the moment between them, discreetly stepped back toward the schoolhouse door. "I'll give you a moment to say your goodbyes, Miss Prescott. Please join me when you're ready." When they were alone, Lucas cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I suppose this is goodbye then." Willa nodded, blinking rapidly. "Yes, I suppose it is." Neither moved for a long moment. Finally, Lucas extended his hand. "Good luck with your teaching, Miss Prescott. The children of Placerville are fortunate to have you." Willa took his hand, but instead of shaking it, she impulsively rose on tiptoe and pressed a quick kiss to his weathered cheek. "Thank you, Lucas," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "For everything." Before he could respond, she turned and hurried into the schoolhouse, leaving him standing in the dusty street with his hand raised to the spot her lips had touched. The ride back to his ranch seemed longer and lonelier than any journey Lucas could remember. The cabin, when he finally reached it as evening shadows lengthened across the valley, felt emptier than it ever had before Willa's arrival. Her presence lingered in small touches, the way she had arranged his few dishes on a shelf, the mended curtain at the window, the faint scent of her that still clung to the bedding. Lucas told himself it was for the best. Willa was educated, refined, destined for better things than the hard life of a rancher's wife. She would thrive in town, respected as the schoolteacher, eventually marrying some shopkeeper or banker who could provide her with comforts and security. The thought brought no comfort as he prepared a solitary meal and ate it in silence at the table where, just that morning, Willa had sat across from him, her green eyes bright with anticipation for her new beginning. Days passed, then weeks. Lucas threw himself into his work, rising before dawn and collapsing into exhausted sleep after dark. He avoided trips to Placerville, sending a young neighbor boy to fetch supplies when necessary, paying him with fresh beef or occasional coins. But thoughts of Willa continued to plague him. He wondered how she was faring, if the children respected her, if she was happy in her new position. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, he would take out the handkerchief she had mended for him and run his thumb across the neat stitches, remembering her slender fingers working the needle by firelight. 1 month after he had left Willa at the schoolhouse, Lucas was forced to make the trip to town himself when his plow broke beyond his ability to repair it. The blacksmith, Jake Simmons, was an old friend from Lucas's mining days and the only man within 50 miles skilled enough to forge the necessary replacement parts. "Morgan," Jake boomed when Lucas entered the sweltering smithy. "Beginning to think you died out there in that valley of yours. Haven't seen you in a month of Sundays." Lucas managed a tight smile. "Been busy with the planting." Jake grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. "Too busy to show your face in town, or are you avoiding someone in particular?" Lucas stiffened. "Don't know what you're talking about." "No," Jake's grin widened. "That's not what I hear. Word is you and the new schoolmarm had quite the arrangement before you brought her to town." "There was no arrangement," Lucas snapped, his temper flaring. "She was robbed and stranded. I helped her, that's all." Jake held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No offense meant. Just repeating what folks are saying. Besides," he added, his expression turning more serious, "Miss Prescott speaks mighty highly of you, tells anyone who'll listen how you saved her life." Lucas's irritation subsided, replaced by curiosity. "You've spoken to her. My Ellie's in her class," Jake explained. "Says Miss Prescott is the best teacher they've ever had. Got the older boys behaving, if you can believe it. Even Tim Matthews sits still for her, and that boy's been wild as a March hare since he learned to walk." Despite himself, Lucas smiled at the thought of Willa taming the notorious Matthews boy. "She's good with people," he acknowledged. Jake studied him for a moment, then set down his hammer. "She asks about you, you know. Every time Ellie brings home a note or report, there's always a question tucked in. How is Mr. Morgan faring? Has Mr. Morgan recovered from his bout of illness?" "Illness?" Lucas frowned. "I haven't been ill." "That's what I told Ellie, but Miss Prescott seemed to think otherwise. Said it must be something serious to keep you from town so long." Jake's eyes twinkled. "Seemed mighty concerned for someone who was just helped, if you ask me." Lucas felt a surge of hope at Jake's words, quickly suppressed. "She's just being polite, grateful." "If you say so," Jake replied skeptically. "Now, about this plow of yours." As they discussed the repairs, Lucas found his thoughts continually drifting back to what Jake had said about Willa asking after him. Could she possibly have felt the same inexplicable connection he had? The idea seemed too unlikely, too hopeful to credit. With the plow parts ordered, Lucas reluctantly prepared to leave town without seeking Willa out. His appearance dusty from the trail, unshaven for days, was hardly presentable, and the thought of facing her in such a state made him uncomfortable. Better to wait until he could at least make himself respectable. Fate, however, had other plans. As he untied his horse from the hitching post outside the general store, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Willa hurrying across the street toward him, a group of children trailing behind her like ducklings after their mother. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and the sight of her knocked the breath from his lungs. She looked well better than well. She was radiant, her cheeks flushed with health, her eyes bright. "Mr. Morgan," she said as she reached him, slightly breathless from her hurried crossing. "I thought that was you. What a pleasant surprise." Lucas removed his hat, acutely conscious of his disheveled appearance. "Miss Prescott, you're looking well." "As are you," she replied, though her eyes registered concern as they took in the shadows beneath his eyes, the gauntness of his face. Though perhaps a bit tired, before he could respond, one of the children tugged at Willa's skirt. "Miss Prescott, is this the cowboy who saved you from dying in the desert?" Lucas felt his face heat as Willa smiled down at the young girl. "Yes, Martha, this is Mr. Morgan. Children, please say hello to the man I've told you about in our lessons on frontier heroism." A chorus of "hello, Mr. Morgan" rose from the group of youngsters, their expressions ranging from awe to shy curiosity. "You've been teaching them about me?" Lucas asked, mortified. Willa's cheeks colored. "I use real examples when possible. It makes the lessons more engaging." She turned to the children. "Now, remember what we discussed about pioneer courtesy. What do we say to someone who has performed a service for another? Thank you for saving Miss Prescott," the children recited in unison. "We like her very much and would be sad if she had died." Despite his embarrassment, Lucas couldn't help but smile at their earnest faces. "You're welcome," he replied gravely. "I'm glad she's here to teach such well-mannered students." The children beamed at the compliment. One boy, bolder than the rest, stepped forward. "Did you really carry Miss Prescott on your horse like in the stories, and feed her soup one spoonful at a time when she was too weak to feed herself?" Lucas glanced at Willa, who looked mortified. "Timothy Matthews, that's quite enough. Mr. Morgan's actions are not for public discussion." She turned to the group. "Children, please proceed to the church for our nature sketching lesson. I'll join you momentarily." As the children scampered off, Willa turned back to Lucas, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry about that." Children repeat everything they hear, I'm afraid, and I may have shared more details with Mrs. Davenport than was strictly necessary. "It's all right," Lucas assured her, finding her discomfort endearing. "No harm done." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Finally, Willa spoke. "How have you been, truly? I've been concerned. Jake Simmons said you haven't been to town in weeks." "I've been busy with the spring planting," Lucas explained, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "And the plow broke. That's why I'm here today, actually." "I see." Willa's disappointment was evident, though she tried to hide it. "Well, I'm glad it's just work keeping you away and not illness or injury." Lucas studied her face, searching for the meaning behind her words. "You've been worried about me, of course," she admitted softly. "After everything you did for me, how could I not care about your welfare?" The word care hung between them, weighted with possibility. Before Lucas could form a response, a matronly woman called from the boarding house porch. "Miss Prescott, the children are waiting at the church." Willa glanced over her shoulder. "I'll be right there, Mrs. Davenport." Turning back to Lucas, she said hurriedly, "I must go. But please, don't be such a stranger. The children would love to hear more about ranching, I'm sure. Perhaps you could visit the school sometime, as a guest speaker." The invitation was clearly about more than educating her students, and Lucas found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. "I could do that. Maybe next week when the planting's done." Willa's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Wonderful." Tuesday afternoons are our natural history lessons. 1 o'clock would be perfect. "Tuesday at 1, Lucas confirmed, returning her smile. "I'll be there." She hesitated as if wanting to say more, then impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "It's truly good to see you, Lucas," she said softly, using his given name again before turning and hurrying after her students. Lucas stood motionless in the street, watching her retreating figure until she disappeared into the church. The spot on his arm where her fingers had rested seemed to burn through the fabric of his shirt, and for the first time in weeks, something like hope kindled in his chest. The following Tuesday found Lucas outside the schoolhouse at precisely 1 o'clock, freshly shaven and wearing his best shirt. He'd even polished his boots, a detail that made him feel foolish until he saw the appreciative gleam in Willa's eyes as she welcomed him into the classroom. The lesson was a success beyond anything Lucas could have anticipated. The children, initially shy in the presence of the tall, serious rancher, quickly warmed to his straightforward explanations of cattle breeding, crop rotation, and the delicate balance of frontier ecology. By the end of the hour, they were gathered around him, peppering him with questions that ranged from the practical, "How do you know when a cow is sick?" to the absurd, "Have you ever wrestled a bear?" Willa watched from her desk, her expression a mixture of amusement and admiration. When the school bell rang to signal the end of the day, she had to raise her voice to be heard over the excited chatter. "Children, please thank Mr. Morgan for his time and gather your things. Remember, your essays on frontier agriculture are due Friday." After the students had filed out, many lingering to shake Lucas's hand or show him a treasured rock or feather they'd collected, Willa approached him with a warm smile. "You were wonderful with them. I don't think I've ever seen Timothy Matthews sit still for so long." Lucas ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. "They're good kids. Smart, too. That little girl with the red hair, Martha. She asked better questions about soil composition than most grown farmers I know." "Martha has a scientific mind," Willa agreed. "I'm hoping to convince her parents to let her continue her education beyond primary school. She could go far with proper training." Lucas nodded, impressed by Willa's dedication to her students' futures. It was clear she took her responsibilities seriously, seeing potential in each child regardless of gender or background. This was yet another quality to admire in a woman who already occupied far too many of his thoughts. "Would you care to join me for coffee?" Willa asked suddenly, breaking into his reverie. "Mrs. Davenport always has a pot brewing, and I'd enjoy catching up properly without 20 pairs of ears listening to every word." The invitation surprised him, but he found himself accepting before he could consider the propriety. "I'd like that." The walk to the boarding house was short but pleasant, the spring afternoon warm without being oppressive. They spoke of inconsequential things: the weather, the town's growth, the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, but beneath the casual conversation ran a current of awareness that made every glance, every accidental brush of hands, significant. Mrs. Davenport, a plump, pleasant woman with shrewd eyes, greeted them at the door. "Miss Prescott, Mr. Morgan, come in, come in. I've fresh coffee and some of those molasses cookies you're fond of, Miss Prescott." The front parlor of the boarding house was neat and comfortable, if somewhat fussy with doilies and figurines. Mrs. Davenport served them coffee and cookies, before excusing herself with a knowing smile that made Lucas uncomfortable and Willa blush. "I apologize for Mrs. Davenport," Willa said once they were alone. "She's a romantic at heart and tends to see courtship where there is merely friendship." "Is that what this is?" Lucas asked before he could stop himself. "Friendship." Willa's eyes widened slightly at his directness. She set down her cup carefully, considering her response. "I would like to think so, yes, after what we shared." That is, after the time I spent recovering at your home, I feel a connection to you that I would not want to lose. Nor would I, Lucas admitted, encouraged by her candor. But I wonder if friendship is all that's between us. Color rose in Willa's cheeks, but she didn't look away. What are you suggesting, Mr. Morgan? I'm not sure, he confessed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I only know that since you left, my cabin has felt empty in a way it never did before you arrived. I find myself thinking of you at odd moments, wondering what you would say about a particular sunset, or how you would laugh at some silly thing my horse does. He paused, gathering courage. I miss you, Willa, more than makes sense for someone who was in my life so briefly. Willa's expression softened, vulnerability replacing her earlier composure. I've missed you too, Lucas, more than I should, perhaps, given my position here. As the town's teacher, I'm expected to maintain certain standards of behavior. I understand, Lucas said, his heart sinking despite the admission of mutual feeling. A schoolteacher, especially an unmarried one, lived under constant scrutiny. Her reputation had to be above reproach. But, Willa continued, her voice strengthening, I'm not willing to let expectations dictate my happiness. Not anymore. That's why I left Boston in the first place, to escape the constraints of society's rules about what a woman should be and do. Hope flared again in Lucas's chest. What are you saying? Willa reached across the small table between them to touch his hand. I'm saying that I would like to explore what exists between us, Lucas Morgan. Properly, with respect for both my position and your reputation in this community, but honestly and without artifice. Lucas turned his hand to clasp hers, marveling at the softness of her skin against his calloused palm. I'd like that very much. From that day forward, Lucas and Willa began a courtship that soon became the talk of Placerville. Lucas made weekly trips to town, often arriving with small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the valley, a particularly fine apple from his small orchard, once even a kitten from his barn cat's litter that became the unofficial mascot of the schoolhouse. They attended church together on Sundays, walked through town in the evenings, and occasionally enjoyed dinner at the hotel restaurant under Mrs. Davenport's approving eye. Lucas even volunteered to repair the sagging steps of the schoolhouse, a project that gave him legitimate reason to be near Willa during school hours. As summer arrived, bringing scorching heat to the Arizona territory, Willa accepted Lucas's invitation to visit his ranch on a Saturday, accompanied by Mrs. Davenport as chaperone. The older woman, understanding the growing attachment between the couple, tactfully occupied herself with a book on the porch while Lucas showed Willa the improvements he had made to the property. I've added a room, he explained as they walked around the cabin. Thought it might make a good study someday place for books and quiet thinking. Willa examined the addition, noting the larger-than-average window that would allow ample light for reading. It's wonderful, Lucas. You've clearly put a lot of thought into it. Had someone in mind when I designed it, he admitted, watching her face carefully for her reaction. She met his gaze, understanding his meaning. It's perfect, she said softly. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Lucas finally gathered the courage to speak the words that had been building in his heart for months. Willa, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I know I'm not the kind of man you probably imagined for yourself. I'm not educated or cultured. What I have, I've built with my own hands, and it's not much compared to what you might have had back east. Lucas, she tried to interrupt, but he held up a hand. Please let me finish. I need to say this. He took a deep breath. When I found you on that trail, half dead from hunger and exposure, something changed in me. Caring for you, Watching you fight your way back to health, it woke up parts of me I thought had died in the war or been buried by years of solitude." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "I'm not offering you an easy life, Willa. Ranching is hard work, and this territory can be unforgiving. But I promise you'd never be hungry or afraid again. I'd spend every day making sure of that." Opening the box, he revealed a simple gold band set with a small, perfect emerald. "I chose this because it reminded me of your eyes, the first thing I really noticed about you when you woke up in my cabin. They had such life in them, even when the rest of you was at its weakest." Willa's own eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, then at Lucas's earnest face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Willa Prescott," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a long moment, Willa was silent, tears spilling down her cheeks. Lucas felt a cold dread begin to build in his stomach. Had he misread her feelings? Was she trying to find a gentle way to refuse him? Then suddenly she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest. "Yes," she sobbed. "Yes, Lucas Morgan, I will marry you." Relief and joy swept through him as he held her close, his own eyes damp. Over her shoulder, he caught sight of Mrs. Davenport discreetly wiping tears from her cheeks before slipping back into the cabin to give them privacy. When Willa finally pulled back to look at him, her smile was radiant despite her tears. "I've known since you fed me that first spoonful of broth," she admitted. "No one had ever shown me such tender care, such patience. You saw me at my most vulnerable and treated me with dignity and respect. How could I not fall in love with you?" Lucas gently slid the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Willa Prescott, more than I ever thought possible." Their first kiss was sweet and tentative, a promise of the life they would build together. When they parted, Willa looked up at him with such happiness that Lucas felt his heart might burst from the fullness of his own joy. The wedding took place at the end of summer, after Willa had completed her first full term as Placerville's teacher. The town council, initially concerned about losing their prized educator, was mollified when Willa proposed continuing her duties until a replacement could be found and trained, even offering to ride in from the ranch 3 days a week if necessary. The ceremony itself was held in the town church, which overflowed with well-wishers. Lucas, uncomfortable in a new suit purchased for the occasion, stood at the altar with Jake Simmons as his best man, watching in awe as Willa walked down the aisle in a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Davenport and the other ladies of the town had helped sew. She had never looked more beautiful, her face glowing with happiness, her hair arranged in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, Lucas felt as though his life was truly beginning, all that had come before merely preparation for this moment. The reception that followed at the town hall was the most festive event Placerville had seen in years. Everyone contributed something: food, music, decorations, creating a celebration that reflected the community's genuine affection for the couple. Even Lucas, normally reserved in crowds, found himself enjoying the dancing and merriment, especially when it meant holding Willa in his arms as they twirled around the floor. As evening fell, they slipped away from the celebration to begin their journey home to the ranch that would now truly be a home with Willa by his side. The wagon was festooned with ribbons and flowers, a large sign proclaiming "Just Married" tied to the back, courtesy of Lucas's ranch hands who had kept the property running during his absence. The drive to the ranch was quiet, both of them tired from the day's emotions and activities, but contentedly so. When they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, lamplight glowing warmly in the windows, Willa gasped in surprise. "Who lit the lamps?" she asked, turning to Lucas with curiosity. He smiled, pleased that his surprise had remained intact. "Jake's wife, Ellie. She came out early to prepare things for us. Said a bride shouldn't have to worry about practical matters on her wedding night." Willa blushed prettily at the reference but squeezed his hand in appreciation. When they reached the cabin, however, Lucas didn't immediately help her down from the wagon. Instead, he set the brake and turned to her with serious eyes. "Before we go in, I want you to know something," he said, taking both her hands in his. "From the moment I found you on that trail, this has been your home. Even when you weren't here, part of you remained. Now that you've returned, I want you to truly make it yours. Change whatever you want, rearrange, rebuild anything that would make you happy." Touched by his words, Willa leaned forward to kiss him softly. "The only thing I need to be happy is you, Lucas Morgan. Everything else is just details." He smiled against her lips, then pulled back with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, Mrs. Morgan, there is one tradition I intend to observe." Before she could respond, he had scooped her into his arms and carried her to the cabin door, which he managed to open without setting her down. "Welcome home, wife," he murmured as he carried her across the threshold. "Home," Willa repeated, her arms around his neck, her head resting against his shoulder. "Yes, this is definitely home." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Morgan Ranch. Willa continued teaching until a suitable replacement was found, a young man from Chicago, with progressive ideas about education that matched her own. Even after officially resigning her position, she remained involved with the school, organizing a lending library and occasionally substituting when needed. At home, she transformed the cabin into a true haven, adding curtains and cushions for comfort, bookshelves for their growing collection of volumes, and eventually a nursery for their first child, Samuel, who arrived a year after their wedding. Strong and healthy from birth, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, Samuel quickly became the center of their world. 2 years later, twins Elizabeth and William joined the family, testing Lucas and Willa's energy and patience, but multiplying their joy. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family, with Lucas and his hired hands adding 2 more bedrooms and enlarging the kitchen, where Willa now cooked for hungry ranch workers as well as her own brood. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Lucas's cattle herd grew, and with Willa's encouragement, he diversified into horses as well, breeding sturdy stock well suited to the demanding terrain. Willa kept meticulous accounts, her teaching background proving invaluable in the business aspects of ranching, and started a kitchen garden that eventually grew to provide much of their produce needs. Through it all, the bond between them only strengthened. The passion of their early marriage matured into a deep, abiding love grounded in respect and partnership. They faced hardships together, droughts that threatened the herd, illness that swept through the children one terrible winter, the occasional dispute with neighbors over water rights or grazing boundaries, and emerged stronger for having weathered them side by side. On their 10th anniversary, Lucas surprised Willa with a trip back east to visit friends in Boston and show their children the city where their mother had grown up. The journey was long and at times uncomfortable, but the wonder on the children's faces as they experienced the bustling metropolis made every hardship worthwhile. In Boston, Willa reconnected with former colleagues from the Roxbury Ladies' Academy, many of whom were astonished at the transformation in their once proper colleague. The reserved, conventional teacher had become a confident frontier woman, her skin sun-kissed, her manner direct, her love for her rugged husband and 3 lively children obvious to all who saw them together. Are you ever sorry you left all this behind?" Lucas asked one evening as they strolled through the public garden, the children racing ahead to examine the swan boats pulled up for the night. Willa considered the question seriously, looking around at the manicured paths, the elegant townhouses visible beyond the park's edge, the well-dressed couples passing by with measured steps. "Not for a moment," she answered truthfully. "I thought I wanted adventure when I headed west, but what I found was so much more valuable. I found purpose. I found home." She squeezed his hand. "I found you." Lucas brought her hand to his lips, a gesture that still made her heart skip even after a decade of marriage. "You know, sometimes I still can't believe my luck that the woman I found half dead on the trail would turn out to be the love of my life, the mother of my children, the heart of our home." Willa smiled up at him, the lines at the corners of her eyes only adding character to her still beautiful face. "It wasn't luck, Lucas. It was destiny. I truly believe that." They returned to Arizona with renewed appreciation for the life they had built together. The ranch continued to thrive, and as the children grew, they took on increasing responsibilities, each developing special interests and talents. Samuel showed a gift for working with horses. Elizabeth inherited her mother's love of books and teaching, and William demonstrated a knack for mechanics and invention that promised to bring modern improvements to the ranch's operation. 20 years after Lucas found Willa collapsed on the trail, their home was the heart of a successful enterprise and the gathering place for friends and family throughout the territory. The original cabin, though now expanded and improved, still stood at the center of a complex of buildings that included a bunkhouse for workers, a proper barn, stables, and storage sheds. On the anniversary of their first meeting, a date they had always marked in some special way, Lucas took Willa riding to a promontory overlooking the valley. They dismounted and spread a blanket in the shade of a gnarled juniper tree, unpacking the picnic lunch Willa had prepared. "Do you realize," Lucas said as they sat side by side, looking out over the land they had nurtured together, "that today marks exactly 20 years since I found you on the trail?" Willa nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. Though her hair now showed strands of silver among the brown, and Lucas's once dark beard had gone mostly gray, their bodies still fit together perfectly. 20 years. Sometimes it seems impossible that so much time has passed, and sometimes it feels as though I've known you forever. Lucas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "Remember how I fed you that first bowl of broth, one spoonful at a time because you were too weak to hold the spoon yourself?" "I remember," Willa said softly. "You were so gentle, so patient. I thought you must be a dream that I had died on the trail, and you were some angel sent to ease my passing." Lucas chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. Some angel unshaven, smelling of horse and cattle, living alone in a cabin barely fit for human habitation. "The best kind of angel," Willa insisted, tilting her face up to his. "The kind that saves you not just from death, but from a life half-lived." Lucas bent to kiss her, still marveling at how this remarkable woman had chosen to build a life with him. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in paper. "I have something for you," he said, placing it in her hands. "A poor token for 20 years of happiness, but I thought you might like it." Willa unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a small silver spoon, beautifully crafted and engraved with their initials and the date. "Oh, Lucas," she breathed, running her finger over the delicate engraving. "To remember how it all began," he explained. "One spoonful at a time." Tears welled in Willa's eyes as she clutched the spoon to her heart. "It's perfect, absolutely perfect." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the valley in the same golden hues that had welcomed Willa to this land 2 decades earlier. They sat in companionable silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here from a desperate encounter on a dusty trail to a life rich with love, family, and purpose. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Willa asked after a while, her voice thoughtful. "What's that, my love?" "I think about how close I came to dying out there, how if you had taken a different route that day, or left home an hour later, you might never have found me." She shuddered slightly at the thought. "And then I think about all that would never have been our children, this ranch, these years together. It makes me cherish every moment all the more." Lucas tightened his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I found you because I was meant to find you, Willa Morgan. And I'll keep finding you every day for as long as we both shall live." As they gathered their things and mounted their horses for the ride home to where their grown son and nearly grown twins would be waiting, where the lamps would be lit in welcome, where memories of 2 decades lived in harmony filled every corner, Willa looked at her husband with the same wonder she had felt when he first appeared on that dusty trail, a silhouette against the blazing sky. "I love you, Lucas Morgan," she said simply, "today and always." "And I love you, Willa Morgan," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "from the first spoonful to the last breath." Together, they rode down the hill toward home, toward the future they continued to build one day at a time, their lives intertwined as completely as the roots of the ancient juniper trees that dotted their beloved land, strong, enduring, and ever growing beneath the vast Arizona sky.